Magic the Gathering has a lot of keywords. It's a natural byproduct of a game with an over 30-year lifespan. Keywords are essentially shorthand for mechanics and game actions that make it so that not every card has to re-explain in full when it does something that 100 cards printed before it also do. Or otherwise read like the collected works of Shakespeare, though as of late this has been less of a constraint. I was stirred one day by a thought beamed into my brain by some sort of higher power to read and categorize every single keyword in Magic's history, and never one to shy away from a goal so needless and time-consuming, I accepted. So come one, come all, and join me in my hopefully indestructible submarine as we plumb the depths of... So here it is. All of Magic's Commander legal keyworded abilities and actions, give or take a few, from the perfect children that are the Evergreen, all the way down to the horrors of the deep that one should not dare to mention. Above the water, we have those deemed worthy of official design designations, which made them easy to slot into their respective categories. While some mechanics have moved in and out of these top rungs over time, they are the most generally accepted terms that are more than likely to show up in a set or two at least over the course of a year. As we stray below the waterline, things get a little bit more murky. An important distinction to bear in mind is the difference between a keyword, a word that has an innate rules definition, and an ability word, a term that is never found on a card separately from a definition of what it does. The easy way to tell the difference is that if a keyword is defined, it's always in reminder text, italicized and in brackets, whereas an ability word will be italicized itself and followed by a dash, with its definition contained within the following rules text. This difference is why landfall and many others do not appear on this list. While it is deciduous and appears with reasonable frequency, it's not actually keyworded. You or permanents you control don't landfall. They have landfall, an ability that triggers based on whether a land has entered the battlefield under your control this turn. Anyway, this might be a long one, and you came here for sweet, sweet keywords, so I hope you're comfortable. Let's begin. The Evergreen. These are the mechanical building blocks of Magic, and heavily woven into its DNA. Let's start with the alpha babies. The good old boys of Magic that do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of making the game work at the basic level. Keyworded in 6th edition, to activate an activated ability is to put it on the stack and pay its costs, with the intention of it resolving and having its effect. Starting simple. Cast, the reason we're all here. The terminology for putting a spell on the stack, paying its costs, and praying it resolves and has an effect was introduced with Alpha, replaced with play in the 6th edition rules changes, and eventually had its triumphant return in Magic 2010. Even some basic principles have had rocky roads to make it to this point, and that's worth remembering the next time you're feeling down in the dumps. Love it or hate it, to counter a spell or ability is to remove it from the stack, preventing it from resolving or having an effect, and putting it into its owner's graveyard if it's a spell. Remember, no refunds. Create, the action of putting a token onto the battlefield, has existed conceptually since Alpha, but was not formally keyworded until 2016's Kaladesh? Talk about a late bloomer. Keyworded in Champions of Kamigawa, a creature with Defender, cannot attack. To destroy a permanent, it is moved from the battlefield to its owner's graveyard, which may be the result of an effect that says destroy or lethal damage. And if this happens to a creature or planeswalker, it dies. To discard a card, is to move it from its owner's hand to their graveyard. Enchant specifies and importantly restricts what an aura spell may target and an aura may enchant or be attached to. To exchange is to swap, which may be control of spells or permanents between players, objects in different zones such as the hand, graveyard, or library, or numerical values such as life totals or power and toughness. It was keyworded in the 6th edition rules changes to help consolidate the terminology for these sorts of effects. Exile is another example of the concept, that is, removing an object from the game, existing since alpha, but not being given the terminology or keyworded until the Magic 2010 rules update. First Strike modifies the rules for the combat damage step by introducing an additional one. During the initial combat damage step, only creatures with First Strike, and its overly eager son Double Strike, which was born in Legions, deal damage, with creatures without those abilities dealing their combat damage in the second. Creatures with Double Strike also deal damage in the second step. Flying, the first mechanic designed by Richard Garfield and every green player's nightmare, makes creatures without flying unable to block creatures with flying. The exception to this is Reach, of course, which was not keyworded until Future Sight. Haste, another mechanic keyworded in 6th edition, allows a creature to attack or its abilities with the tap or untap symbol in their cost to be activated, even if it hasn't been controlled continuously since its controller's most recent turn began, ignoring the normal rules of Summoning Sickness. Keyworded in Darksteel, Indestructible prevents a permanent from being destroyed by damage or effects that say destroy. Play, as previously mentioned, used to include the casting of cards, but is now typically used to refer to the action of playing lands. It also covers the case of effects like Reckless Impulse, otherwise known as Impulse Draw, where you are allowed to either cast spells or play lands exiled with it. Protection, or protection from, prevents the permanent or player from being damaged by, enchanted, equipped, or fortified by, blocked, or targeted by sources with the specified quality, typically being a color or card type. This is typically recalled using the acronym DEBT. DEBT. To sacrifice a permanent, its controller moves it to its owner's graveyard, and while the eponymous sacrifice was printed in alpha, the action wasn't keyworded until revised. To search is to look at all cards in a specified zone, and find one that matches the given description, and to shuffle is to randomize a library or a pile of cards so that no player knows their order. To tap a permanent is to rotate it sideways, yes, sideways, from an upright position, and to untap a permanent is to rotate it back to upright from a sideways position. Don't think I need to take 5 minutes explaining these ones, but then again, I have seen how some of you shuffle and tap your lands. Trample modifies the rules for how combat damage is assigned, allowing the controller of a creature with trample to have it deal excess damage after lethal damage is assigned to any blockers to the player, planeswalker, or battle that creature is attacking. While introduced in Alpha, Trample was later removed in 6th edition due to designers thinking it was too confusing for newer players, opting instead to release creatures that could assign damage as though they weren't blocked. Trample returned in 9th edition, given a less than warm reception to the new ability, which was colloquially termed Super Trample. The last of our OG keywords, Vigilance, allows creatures to attack without tapping. It was keyworded in Champions of Kamigawa. Vigilance. Attaching is to move an aura, equipment, or fortification, coming back to that one later, onto another object or player. Remember, it's customary to place it so that it's physically touching the permanent. An aura, equipment, or fortification becomes unattached when it stops being attached to an object or player, whether that be the result of an object leaving the battlefield, a player leaving the game, the attacher being attached elsewhere, or, mostly in the case of equipment, an ability. Attach arrived with equipment, and thus equip, in Mirrodin, with the terminology being later expanded to auras in 9th edition to help streamline their terminology. Death Touch was introduced in Future Sight. There is going to be a theme there going forward. A creature with toughness greater than 0 dealt damage by a source with Death Touch since the last time state-based actions were checked is destroyed as a state-based action, making any amount of damage from that source lethal. This is particularly pertinent when it comes to blocking, as if a creature with 2 power and Death Touch, like Acidic Slime, is blocked by 2 creatures with toughness greater than 1, the attacker may assign 1 lethal damage to the first creature in damage assignment order, then 1 lethal damage to the second, resulting in both dying. Damage assignment order is dead? Okay, so now attackers just assign combat damage between multiple blockers as they wish, specifically during the combat damage step, making it so that you can't make a decision to cast a combat trick as the defending player knowing how damage will be assigned anymore. Fascinating. The fight mechanic, where 2 creatures deal damage equal to their power to each other, was introduced on a Harper Prism promo card? Arena? In 1994, and later keyworded in Innistrad. Flash allows you to play a card that appears on any time you can play an instant, appearing first on the unbelievably fast King Cheetah from Visions, then later being keyworded in Time Spiral. Goad, introduced in Conspiracy Take the Crown, is a multiplayer-specific keyword that forces a creature to attack each combat and a player other than the controller of the source of goading, if able. A permanent is goaded until the source's controller's next turn. Hexproof was introduced in Portal 3 Kingdoms, and ultimately keyworded in Jewels of the Planeswalkers 2012, and prevents a permanent or player from being the target of spells or abilities controlled by their opponents. Lifelink was formally introduced in Mirrodin and keyworded in Future Sight. However, the same effect, to gain life equal to the damage dealt by a source with lifelink, goes all the way back to Arabian Nights El Hajjaj. Unlike many other abilities that have been keyworded, however, this has not been errated to lifelink, and as a result stacks with lifelink, where otherwise multiple instances of the ability would be redundant. Menace finds its origins in Fallen Empires, and was later keyworded in Magic Origins to supersede Intimidate. A creature with Menace cannot be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. Mill, the action of a player putting cards from the top of their library into their graveyard, first appeared on Millstone in Antiquities, but was not given this terminology until Mystery Booster, appearing on the test card Truth or Dare. Legal cards first featuring the terminology were printed in Core Set 2021. Reveal was introduced in the 6th edition rules update, specifically to distinguish between the act of a player looking at something otherwise hidden, with an effect like Gataxian Probe, or whether the information is revealed to the entire table, a la Lost Hours, a difference that became more important with the rise of multiplayer play. To scry, a player looks at the specified number of cards from the top of their library, then decides whether to put them to the bottom or back on top in any order. Initially introduced as a keyword ability in 5th Dawn, it became Evergreen in Magic Origins, and has been errated as a keyword action instead. To round off the last of our Evergreen keywords, it's everyone's favourite, Ward! Hooray! Introduced in Strixhaven School of Mages, Ward is a triggered ability that counters any spell or ability an opponent controls that targets the permanent unless the player pays the specified cost. No need to dwell on this one, I'm sure you're already tired of it. Let's move down a tier, where we have, continuing the tree metaphor, deciduous keywords. These are recurring mechanics that will pop up to support the mechanics of new sets here and there when needed, but just aren't going to be as common as the tier above. Affinity reduces the cost of a spell by 1 generic for each permanent of the type that spell has affinity for that its controller controls, and was introduced in Mirrodin. These cards contributed heavily to what is referred to as the second combo winter, where the extended metagame shifted heavily to fast combo decks. After the release of Darksteel, Affinity became very popular in Standard with the support of Skullclamp, and Arcbound Ravager, the former of which was banned in all formats except Vintage. The archetype remained popular until March 2005, when all 6 artifact lands, Ravager, and Disciple of the Vault were banned in Standard. Despite the negative initial reception, it was promoted to Deciduous status to coincide with its return in Phyrexia All B1. Convoke allows you to tap creatures you control to pay for generic mana costs of the spell, or coloured mana costs of the convoking creature's colour. It was designed by Richard Garfield for Guilds of Ravnica, and as of 2024 has become Deciduous. Crew, and consequentially Vehicular Manslaughter, were introduced to Magic with Kaladesh, appearing on a new artifact subtype, Vehicle. It specifies a value, which you must meet by tapping creatures of total power of that value or greater, in order for the vehicle to become a creature until the end of turn. Buckle up, weenies! Crew is considered high-end Deciduous to low-end Evergreen, a highly unhelpful categorization for the purpose of this exercise, so I'm putting it here. Cycling and its variations allow you to pay a cost, which includes discarding the card in order to draw a card, or search your library for a card of the specified type. It has seen repeated use across sets, but was promoted in Streets of New Capenna. Flashback, first appearing in Odyssey and being designated Deciduous in All B1, allows you to pay an alternate cost for an instant or sorcery to cast it from the graveyard. If this cost is paid, if it would leave the stack through resolving or otherwise, it is exiled instead of being put anywhere else. To investigate is to create a clue token, a colorless artifact with the ability pay 2 generic mana, sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. It was first seen in Shadows over Innistrad. Kicker, or as it is otherwise known, Every Mechanic, allows you to pay an additional cost when casting a spell for an additional effect, effectively making Invasion, where it was introduced, Magic's first real set. Introduced fittingly in Mirage, phasing is the mechanic by which a permanent phases out, and is treated as if it doesn't exist until its controller's next untap step, when it phases in. We will return to the ability of the same name at a later point in our descent. I promise. A creature with prowess gets +1/+1 until end of turn whenever its controller casts a non-creature spell. The ability was designed by Jonathan Lux during the second Great Designer Search, introduced in Khans of Tarkir, and became evergreen in Magic Origins due to the shortage of non-evasion-based combat-relevant keywords in blue. It did, however, become a bit of a problem child after that, causing design issues with overlapping cast triggers like those for Historics in Dominaria, being weaker in creature-dense sets, and it including artifacts and enchantments where in blue and red instants and sorceries were preferred, which ultimately led to it being demoted to Deciduous after Hour of Devastation. I still love it though. Surveil functions similarly to Scry, with the difference that you may put the cards looked at with it back on top or in the graveyard, and I doubt anyone would be surprised to hear that it was introduced in Guilds of Ravnica for House Dimir. Finally in this tier, we have Transform, which was introduced in Innistrad to create more fitting card designs for werewolves, and is simply the action of turning a double-faced card over to change which face of the card is visible, and therefore in play. Now I know what you're thinking. There's more to werewolves in Magic, and we will be getting into that whole mess later. It's time to get our toes wet with the first rung below the water. What I would deem common keywords. They don't have any fancy design designations like their siblings that we've already covered, but there's a good chance you've seen and played with them, and they appear on at least 40 or so cards. Bestow arrived with Theros, and appears on enchantment creatures, providing you the option to cast them as normal, or as an aura spell, typically providing the creature they are attached to bonuses to stats and abilities. Though the new Bestow designs that arrived with Modern Horizons 3 put a twist on the formula with the design of Trickster's Elk and Springheart Nantuko. Buyback is an additional cost that can be traced back to Tempest, allowing the caster to return the spell to their hand instead of their graveyard when the spell resolves if paid. It logically exclusively appears on instants and sorceries, However, the illegal playtest card Innocuous Insect features buyback paired with a draw trigger on cast, which is fun. People love free stuff. When you cast a spell with Cascade, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card with lesser mana value, which you may then cast without paying its mana cost. After this, all cards exiled and not cast this way are put on the bottom of your library in a random order. It was originally a multicolor only mechanic from the multicolor only set Alara Reborn, but made its monocolor debut in Modern Horizons on Throes of Chaos. A creature with Changeling is every creature type. That's it. There are a few of those. It first appeared in Lorwyn, likely as a reference to the myth given the prevalence of fairies in the set, and definitely as a means of making typal strategies work better in draft environments. Another characteristic defining keyword ability, Devoid, was first printed in the Zendikar vs Eldrazi duel decks, and states that a card is colorless regardless of the colors in its mana cost. This is additionally indicated by the use of variations of the transparent Eldrazi frame. Exalted was first printed in Shards of Alara, and gives a creature that attacks alone +1/+1 for each instance of Exalted among permanents you control. In Ixalan, we explored for the first time an ability of a creature that has you reveal the top card of your library, putting it into your hand if it's a land. Otherwise, you put a +1/+1 counter on the exploring creature, and may put the revealed card back on top of your library or into your graveyard. With Fear, we find our first obsolete keyword in this list, replaced initially by Intimidate and ultimately by Menace. A creature with Fear can't be blocked except by black or artifact creatures. It arrived with Alpha, was keyworded in Onslaught, and was ultimately taken out back in Magic 2010. So why is it here? Well, it can be found on over 70 cards, including Cover of Darkness, which was recently reprinted in Assassin's Creed Universes Beyond, which is a lot more than Intimidate. Also, it's my list and I make the rules, okay? While we're here, Intimidate was introduced in Zendikar and was replaced by Menace in Magic Origins, and is essentially the same as Fear, but is not limited to black, instead making a creature with Intimidate unblockable except by artifact creatures and creatures that share a color with it. It was dumped in favor of Menace given the high level of variation it introduces, and the fact that color-changing mechanics are not as common as they used to be made it much harder to counterplay or build for. A card with Foretell allows you to pay 2 generic mana to exile it from your hand face down as a special action, then cast it on a later turn for its Foretell cost. This originated in Kaldheim and... Oh god, what's that smell? A creature with Infect deals damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and players in the form of poison counters, a player with 10 of which loses the game. It was introduced in Scars of Mirrodin, and while being considered for a return in Phyrexia Orb 1, was set aside for the slightly more tolerable Toxic due to the design team's move away from using -1/-1 counters, and the fact that most right-thinking people hate it. If you discard a card with Madness, it is discarded into exile, where you may then cast it for its Madness cost or put it into the graveyard. This was initially optional when it debuted in Torment, but was subtly updated in Shadows over Innistrad so that a card with Madness is always discarded into exile. Another face-down mechanic, Manifest, was introduced in Fate Reforged. A manifested card is put onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature with no name, abilities, color, or creature types, which, if it's a creature on its front face, you may then turn face up any time by paying its mana cost. Dustmourne brought us the variant Manifest Dread, which has you look at the top 2 cards of your library and manifest one of them. putting the other into your graveyard. While Manifest may be from various zones, Manifest Dread is exclusively from the top of your library. Let's move straight on to Manifest's Absentee Father Morph, and its so extra twin brother Megamorph, which was introduced in Onslaught and allows you to cast a card with the ability face down for 3 generic mana as a blank 2/2, the same as Manifest, and turn it face up at any time for its morph cost. Megamorph is the same, you just get to put a +1/+1 counter on it as well. Mega! An original but deprecated mechanic, Regenerate, despite being a touch confusing, sneaks its way into this tier purely by virtue of how many cards it appears on. It is a destruction replacement effect that actually means the next time the permanent would be destroyed, instead all damage marked on it is removed and it becomes tapped. If it was attacking or blocking, it is removed from combat. Got it? A Relic of Legends. Shroud was keyworded in Future Sight and prevents a permanent or player from being the target of spells or abilities, but was supplanted in Magic 2012 by the slightly more functional Hexproof. Time Spiral gave us the thematic Suspend mechanic, which allows you to pay a cost to exile the card with the specified number of time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter, and when the last is removed, you may cast the spell without paying its mana cost. It has haste, which I always forget. Finally, in this tier, we have Unearth from Shards of Alara, which acts as a permanent equivalent to Flashback, allowing you to return a permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield with haste, then exile it at the beginning of the next end step, or if it would otherwise leave the battlefield. Unlike Flashback, however, Unearth is exclusively at sorcery speed. It's official, we have entered mid-range hell. In these next 2 levels of the iceberg, we have 116 keywords to cover, so I'm going to focus more on their mechanics and might miss discussing a few origins here and there. In this tier, we're going to be encountering a mixture of keywords that we see less often, whether that's because they've been phased out, appear on less cards, or are a bit more set-specific than those we've covered already. Let's kick off the uncommon tier with all the mechanics that use counters in one form or another. Adapt allows you to pay a cost to put the specified number of +1/+1 counters on a creature if it has no +1/+1 counters on it. To amass, you create a 0/0 black army creature token if you don't control one. Then put +1/+1 counters on an army you control equal to the amass value. Originally, the mechanic only created zombie armies, but was errated to specify a creature type after its reintroduction in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth with amass orcs. It's also worth mentioning that army is a creature type, so if you control another creature with the type, whether that be a different army, a changeling, or with Maskwood Nexus, that could be the recipient of the +1/+1 counters rather than the token. When a card with backup enters, its controller may put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the value on a target creature. If another creature is chosen, it gets all abilities after backup in the card's rules text until end of turn. The keyword is currently only found on creature cards from March of the Machine. Bolster, introduced in Fate Reforged, has you choose a creature you control with the least or tied for the least toughness, then put a specified number of +1/+1 counters on it. It replaced Outlast from Khans of Tarkir, which has you pay a cost and tap the creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it at sorcery speed, but has been seen less recently than Oath of the Gatewatch's Support, which has you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to a specified number of creatures. Where the fuck is support? Support. Does, however, appear on more cards, including a sticker, so it lives here. Bloodthirst, introduced in Guild Pact for the Gruul, is another +1/+1 counter mechanic where a permanent enters with the specified number of counters if an opponent was dealt damage this turn. A flavorful mechanic similar to Explore, Streets of New Capenna's Connive has you draw a card, discard a card, then put a +1/+1 counter on the conniving creature if a non-land card was discarded this way. There are also cards that feature Connive Number, where you draw and discard the number of cards specified. Cumulative upkeep was introduced in Arabian Nights and keyworded in Ice Age. and requires the controller to pay an increasing cost on each of their upkeeps or sacrifice the permanent. If a permanent with cumulative upkeep is on the battlefield at the beginning of your upkeep, you put an age counter on it, I have accumulated a few of those in my time, then pay the specified cost for each age counter on it, or sacrifice it. While initially just being mana or life costs, Weatherlight introduced alternatives, as well as effects based on age counters. Devour allows you to sacrifice any number of creatures as the creature enters, then put that number times the Devour value +1/+1 counters on the creature. We also have the type-specific variation of Devour, which specifies a permanent type that may be sacrificed and otherwise works the same. A creature with Evolve gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature with greater power or toughness enters under your control. To incubate, you create an incubator token with the specified number of +1/+1 counters on it, and the ability to transform into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature for 2 generic mana. With the introduction of Incubate, we also got a change to the rules around transformation, which previously only applied to double-faced cards, allowing for tokens to transform, meaning that token copies of transforming double-faced permanents could also now transform. A creature with modular enters with the specified number of +1/+1 counters on it, and allows its controller to move its +1/+1 counters onto another target artifact creature when it dies. Monstrosity allows you to pay a cost to put n +1/+1 counters on the creature. If it isn't monstrous, then it becomes monstrous. Magic Origins Renown is somewhat similar, where when a creature with Renown deals combat damage to a player, if it isn't renowned, it gains the designation, and a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the value. Both monstrous and renowned creatures often have abilities that are unlocked when they become so. When a creature with Persist dies, it is returned to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it if it had no -1/-1 counters on it before it died. While Undying is the same thing but with +1/+1 counters. A creature with Toxic, or less but still pretty stinky Infect, gives players the specified number of poison counters in addition to dealing combat damage. A permanent with Vanishing enters with that many time counters on it, then at the beginning of your upkeep you remove a time counter, and when the last is removed, the permanent is sacrificed. And lastly, in our uncommon counter mechanics, we have Wither from Shadowmoor, a creature with which deals combat damage to other creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. R&D has definitely gone off of using -1/-1 counters over time due to the slow play environments that they create, but Wither is deemed innocuous enough to pop up on a card here and there, like Massacre Girl Known Killer from Murders at Karlov Manor. All of the following are essentially Kicker. Bargain provides a bonus effect if you choose to sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast the spell. Entwine allows you to choose all modes of a modal spell if its entwine cost is paid. Gift has you promise an opponent a gift for an extra effect, like a token or a card, which they receive when the spell resolves. So if it's countered, they don't receive the gift. Offspring is also from Bloomburrow, and it allows you to pay an additional cost when casting a spell to create a 1/1 token copy of it when the creature enters, and you can only pay this cost as many times as the card has instances of Offspring. Overload is an alternate cost that, if you paid it, changes all instances of target in the spell's rule text to each, and Replicate allows you to pay the replicate cost any number of times to copy the spell that many times. So, to recap, Sack Kicker, Decision Paralysis Kicker, Nice Kicker, Baby Kicker, Text Kicker, and Copy Kicker. Got it? Our next batch in Uncommon fit roughly under the definition of combat abilities, whether triggered or otherwise. Here we have another stinky mechanic. Annihilator is a triggered ability that makes the defending player sacrifice a specified number of permanents when the creature attacks from Rise of the Eldrazi. The defending player may respond by putting Sadness on the stack. Champions of Kamigawa gave us Bushido, a triggered ability that gives a creature +N/+N when it blocks or becomes blocked. This was considered for a Night-style reskin in Throne of Eldraine, as well as a full-blown return in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, but ultimately passed over due to the board stalls created by the additional difficulty it creates in attacking. As a result, we just got one non-keyworded Bushido effect on Jukai Trainee. Flanking causes a creature without flanking to get -1/-1 until end of turn when blocking a creature with flanking, and features heavily on cards that depict horses or half-man, half-horses, like Time Spiral's Cavalry Master that features the so very magic line of rules text, other creatures you control with flanking have flanking. Fabulous. Whereas creatures with horsemanship cannot be blocked by creatures without horsemanship. Similarly, creatures with shadow cannot be blocked by creatures without shadow. Landwalk is another keyword from Alpha that has since fallen out of favor, being demoted and ultimately made obsolete where it previously held Evergreen status. A creature with Landwalk can't be blocked if the defending player controls a land of the specified type. Its fall can be tied to the issues it creates in counterplay, as removing all of a certain type of land from a deck isn't really an option in the majority of cases. Commander 2015 introduced Myriad, a multiplayer-specific ability that allows its controller to create a tapped and attacking token copy of the creature when it attacks for each other opponent, which are then exiled at the end of combat. Why choose who to hit when you can just hit everyone, right? Now, let's have a look at the mechanics in this tier that can be roughly categorized as alternate casts and/or cost reduction. Aftermath is a split card mechanic, where one half of the card can only be cast from your graveyard, after which it is exiled. Dash allows you to cast a spell for its alternate cost, where if you do, it gains haste and is returned to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. It replaced the ability word Raid from Khans as the ability associated with the Mardu and features on everyone's favorite monkey. Delve arrived in Future Sight and allows you to exile cards from your graveyard to pay generic mana costs of spells with it. Like many cost reduction mechanics, it proved pretty strong. Discover is an updated version of Cascade, which, rather than being a cast trigger, is a keyword action that specifies a value. You exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card with the specified mana value or less, which you may then cast without paying its mana cost, or put it into your hand, after which the exiled cards are returned to the bottom of your library in a random order. This functional change to Cascade allows Discover to feature on a wider range of cards, and avoids the whiffing problem when hitting something like Counterspell. Disguise is the successor to Morph, and features most of the same rules, with the exception that a disguised permanent has Ward 2. This helps avoid the issue of disguised cards trading down in terms of mana spent, where a 1-cost shock could remove a 3-cost morph. While we're here, Murders at Call of Mana also gave us Cloak, which is to manifest what Disguise is to morph. And similarly, a cloaked card has Ward 2. Disturb, Escape, and Retrace are all alternative costs for casting cards from your graveyard. Spells with Disturb can be cast transformed from your graveyard for the Disturb cost, per normal timing rules. Escape allows you to cast a spell from the graveyard for its escape cost, and Retrace allows you to cast the card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to its other costs. On a somewhat similar vein, a spell with Rebound is exiled instead of being put into the graveyard as it resolves if it was cast from your hand, and allows you to cast it without paying its mana cost from exile at the beginning of your next upkeep. This is a loose grouping of cards so nice you played them twice. Evoke allows you to pay an alternate cost to cast a spell, then sacrifice it when it enters the battlefield. As a result, it is tied to abilities that trigger when the permanent enters or leaves the battlefield. While the rules would function for other permanent types, it currently exclusively appears on creatures, specifically with the elemental type. A spell with Improvise allows you to tap artifacts you control to pay its generic mana cost. It's like Convoke, but for artifacts. Ninjutsu allows you to pay a cost to return an unblocked attacking creature you control to your hand, then put the creature with Ninjutsu onto the battlefield tapped and attacking instead. You probably best know this ability from getting absolutely shit-stomped by Not That Yuriko deck, which features the more specific Commander ninjutsu, which expands the ability to both the command zone and the hand. Outlaws of Thunder Junction's plot allows you to pay a cost to exile the card from your hand as a special action at sorcery speed, then cast it on a later turn at sorcery speed without paying its mana cost. Like all good villains, you reveal your dastardly scheme well before it happens. The monologue is optional. A spell with Split Second prevents players from casting spells or activating non-mana abilities for as long as it's on the stack, whereas a spell with Storm does the exact opposite, absolutely flooding the stack by being copied for each spell cast before it that turn. Introduced in Scourge, Storm set the bar for broken mechanics and gives its name to the Storm Scale, the measure of how likely a mechanic is to return to standard. Though, I swear I saw something recently. These last few keywords defy categorization, but are otherwise fairly normal. Well, mostly. Ascend grants you the City's Blessing for the rest of the game if you have 10 or more permanents, with spells and permanents that feature the keyword gaining additional abilities or effects if you do. It's worth noting that permanents with Ascend constantly check if this condition is met, at which point you are granted the City's Blessing, whereas instants and sorceries check once when they resolve. To clash, put them up. Each clashing player reveals the top card of their library, then puts it on the top or bottom, with the winner of the clash being the player who reveals the card with the highest mana value. While it wasn't particularly popular when it debuted, it has since reappeared on Marvo Deep Operative from Murders at Karlov Manor Commander. Craft is an artifact transform mechanic from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. To craft, the player exiles the permanent with craft, exiles the materials specified, which can be on the battlefield or in your graveyard, and pays a mana cost. Echo at its inception in Urza's Saga meant that if a permanent had come under your control since the beginning of your last upkeep, you sacrificed it unless you paid its mana cost. Though in Time Spiral, it was updated to include a corresponding Echo cost, opening up design space by not having Echo tied to the mana cost of the card, at which point all previous Echo cards were updated to reflect this change. Neither Exert or Exploit have any inherent benefit, and are instead keyword actions that trigger other abilities. Exerting a permanent causes it not to untap during your next untap step, and is either part of a cost to activate an ability, or an option when attacking that triggers another ability, while Exploit allows you to sacrifice a creature when the creature with Exploit enters, which will then trigger another ability. To populate, you create a token that's a copy of a creature token you control. Soul Bond from Avacyn Restored is Banding Light. When a creature with Soul Bond enters, it may be paired with another unpaired creature, and remain so for as long as you control both of them. If a creature with Soul Bond is on the battlefield and not paired when another creature enters under your control, you may pair them. Creatures with Soul Bond typically have beneficial abilities for both paired creatures for as long as they remain paired. Sweet, sweet democracy. Vote first appeared in Conspiracy, and makes players vote from among given options in tandem with the Will of the Council, Council's Dilemma, and Secret Council mechanics. Secret Council is exactly that. Secret. Will of the Council cares about a majority, and in Council's Dilemma votes, the number of votes for each option matters. Of course, if someone in your pod is playing around voting, you should be asking how they are trying to rig it. Oh my god, what is that delicious liquid? See what you're missing out on, sponsors? We've reached the rare tier, which, if this video was a pack, you would have skipped straight to. We're starting to get a bit more obscure with these keywords. Whether that's because they're more set-specific, in a number of cases one and done, or simply just because they don't turn up on cards that often. There's more than a couple from more recent sets that may well become less rare in the future, but for now they live here. It's getting dark, huh? Let us continue our voyage with more counters. Another multiplayer mechanic born of Conspiracy, a creature with Dethrone gets +1/+1 counter whenever it attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life. Fabricate is an enters the battlefield effect that allows you to put the specified number of +1/+1 counters on the permanent or create that many 1/1 colorless servo creature tokens. Notably, you don't choose which until the ability resolves, so an opponent must choose to respond before they know which you're choosing. If the permanent with Fabricate is no longer on the battlefield when the ability resolves, you must choose to create the servos. Nemesis gave us Fading, which is the predecessor to Vanishing. The difference being that Fading uses fade counters rather than time counters, and instead of the permanent being sacrificed when the last counter is removed, it is sacrificed if you can't remove a counter from it. So functionally, the turn after the last counter is removed, which is a touch less intuitive. A permanent with Graft enters the battlefield with the specified number of +1/+1 counters on it. Then, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, allows you to move a +1/+1 counter onto it. Guilds of Ravnica's Boros mechanic Mentor helps you buff your smaller creatures, as when a Mentor creature attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on another target attacking creature you control with lesser power. Boros! Innistrad Crimson Vow debuted Training, which mirrors Mentor, giving the creature a +1/+1 counter whenever it attacks with a creature with greater power. Now, rad counters are not a keyword in and of themselves. They are counters, which is a separate thing, of course. However, due to their existence, we were given a new keyword due to mention on cards of life lost from radiation. So, a player with any number of rad counters mills that many cards after their draw step, then loses life and rad counters equal to the number of non-land cards milled this way. This mechanic may end up being set-specific with this terminology, but may return in future sets with a new name, which I'm all for. Another Universes Beyond mechanic, Ravenous, originated in Warhammer 40k Commander. Ravenous cards have an X cost, and enter with a number of +1/+1 counters on them equal to X. If the value of X is 5 or more, the player that casts them draws a card. Read Ahead is a saga-specific keyword that allows the caster to choose a chapter other than one, and put the corresponding number of lore counters on it. You then follow the normal rules of sagas, adding a counter after your draw step, and sacrificing it after the last step. The skipped chapters do not trigger. Reinforce is an activated ability that allows you to pay a cost and discard the card to put the specified number of +1/+1 counters on target creature. A creature with Riot enters with its controller's choice of a +1/+1 counter or haste, while you may have a creature with Unleash enter with a +1/+1 counter on it, and for as long as it has a +1/+1 counter on it, it cannot block. Sunburst appears on artifact or artifact creatures and puts a charge counter or +1/+1 counter respectively on the card when it enters for each different color of mana used to cast it. Tribute has you choose an opponent to either have the creature enter with the specified number of +1/+1 counters on it, or face a punishment in the form of a secondary ability that triggers when the creature enters if tribute was not paid. The next batch of rare keywords we're going to tackle can all be roughly grouped as alternate or additional costs. I'm not going to say it again. Okay, I'm going to say it again. A number of these are kick. Assist was introduced in Battle Bond and allows another player to pay for a portion of the spell's mana cost, and was designed around having a teammate, but does open up some fun potential politicking avenues in Commander. Awaken allows you to pay an alternative cost to additionally put N +1/+1 counters on a land you control, which then becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste in addition to its other types. Blitz was introduced in Streets of New Capenna as the signature mechanic for the Riveteers in Jund, and is an alternate casting cost that gives a creature cast this way haste, and when this creature dies, draw a card. The creature is then sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. The Maestros in Grixis got Casualty, which allows you to sacrifice a creature with the specified power or greater when the spell is cast, then copy it if you do. As of now, all cards with Casualty but one have a fixed casualty value and are instants or sorceries. The sole exception to this is Obnixilis the Adversary. which is a planeswalker with casualty X, with the copy entering with X loyalty counters. Conspire allows you to tap 2 untapped creatures you control that share a color with the spell when you cast it to copy it. Embalm and its sequel Eternalize do fundamentally similar things, allowing you to pay a cost to exile the card from your graveyard and create a token copy that's a zombie in addition to its other types with no mana cost at sorcery speed. The difference is that a token created with Embalm is white and otherwise a direct copy including power and toughness, whereas a token created with Eternalize is black and is always a 4/4. As a result, most creatures with Eternalize have abilities that care about their power and toughness to reward using the mechanic. Emerge allows you to cast a spell by sacrificing a creature and paying the emerge cost reduced by that creature's mana value. Encore was introduced in Commander Legends and allows you to pay a cost to exile the card from your graveyard, then for each opponent create a token copy with haste that must attack that opponent that turn if able. The token copies are then sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step, and you may only encore at sorcery speed. Extort allows you to pay an additional white or black for spells you cast for each opponent to lose 1 life and you to gain that much life. You can choose to pay this cost as many times as you have instances of Extort in play, and it's worth noting that the hybrid mana symbol is in Extort's reminder text, so does not alter a card's color identity. Fuse allows you to cast both sides of a split card at the same time as 1 spell by paying the combined cost at the same time. Importantly, this allows you to get down and dirty. Hideaway is another mechanic that has been tweaked slightly over the years. When introduced in Lorwyn on a cycle of lands, it meant that the permanent entered tapped, that you always looked at the top 4 cards of your library, and that the non-exiled cards were put on the bottom of your library in any order. It has since been refined to have an assigned value and mean that when the permanent enters, you look at the top N cards of your library, exile one of them face down, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. The exiled card gains the suitably verbose line of text, "The player who controls the permanent that exiled this card may look at this card in the exile zone." Typically, there is another ability on these cards that allow you to cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost, or put it into your hand when conditions are met. Jumpstart allows you to cast a spell from your graveyard by discarding a card in addition to paying its other costs, after which it is exiled. Miracle allows you to cast a spell for an alternate cost if it's the first card you drew that turn and reveal it when you draw it. It also features this fun special border. Pretty. Prototype from Brothers War lets you pay a lesser cost to cast an alternate version of a spell. If you do, both on the stack and the battlefield, its prototype characteristics, i.e. the mana cost, color, power, and toughness, replace the defaults. Spectacle is an alternate cost that you can cast a spell for if an opponent has lost life that turn. Champions of Kamigawa gave us Splice, or Splice onto Thing. It allows you to pay a cost to reveal the card as you cast a spell of the type, then add its effects to the spell it is being spliced onto. When it debuted, it was confined to arcane spells, a subtype of instants and sorceries you might recognize from Kadama's Reach, but the specificity led to R&D terming it parasitic, that being too strongly tied to cards from the same set. Late in development, realizing that it should have been designed as splice onto instants or sorcery. It largely ended up being shelved in favor of other mechanics over time, but did appear in this form in Modern Horizons on Splice's Skill and Everdream, as well as the Lord of the Rings holiday release on Fellbeast's Shriek. Spree simply means choose 1 or more additional costs, and appears on instants and sorceries to give them modal options and additional flexibility. You must pay the spell's cost and at least 1 additional cost to cast it, but the option of choosing more gives Spree spells both early and late game applications, and it is definitely one that I'm hoping to see more of in the future. Squad appears on creatures and allows you to pay the squad cost any number of times to create that many token copies of the creature when it enters, and helps facilitate you creating your own army of Gary clones.
Gary!
A spell may be cast for its surge cost if you or a teammate have cast another spell in that same turn. Some spells also feature benefits if that surge cost was paid. Our next little subgroup are all creature-exclusive abilities. Afflict is a kind of pseudo-trample, causing the defending player to lose life equal to the afflict value when the creature is blocked. When a creature with Afterlife dies, its controller creates the specified number of 1/1 white and black spirit creature tokens with flying. Champion is kind of like the queening of Magic. When a permanent with Champion enters, it is sacrificed unless you exile another creature you control, which returns when the championing creature leaves the battlefield. When introduced in Lorwyn, the ability specified creature or a creature type, while Morningtide featured creatures that offered a choice of 2 creature types to champion. A creature with Decayed cannot block, and when they attack, they are sacrificed at the end of combat. No creatures have the keyword as printed, it being confined to tokens or being given to cards by abilities like that of Gissa Glorious Resurrector. Another comparable to banding mechanic, Enlist lets you tap another non-attacking creature you control, specifically without summoning sickness, to add its power to the enlisting creatures until end of turn. To add to its Wild West theming, Outlaws of Thunder Junction gave us saddles, or car creatures. It works similarly to Crew, specifying a value of minimum combined power of creatures you have to tap to saddle the creature until end of turn. However, creatures with saddle are creatures regardless of whether they've been saddled or not. It can only be activated at sorcery speed, and a creature being saddled has no inherent mechanical benefit, rather it corresponds to other abilities that the creature has that check for it. A creature with Battle Cry gives each other attacking creature +1/+0 until end of turn when it attacks. A creature with Melee gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each opponent you have attacked with a creature that turn, and a creature with Skulk cannot be blocked by any creature with greater power, and is typically an annoying little shit. Here we've got a few abilities exclusive to Aura and equipment. Living Weapon from Mirrodin Besieged, and its Mirren counterpart for Mirrodin from All Be One, are both an ability of equipment which create a token, a 0/0 black Phyrexian and a 2/2 red rebel respectively when they enter, which the equipment is then attached to. Reconfigure was introduced with Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and is essentially the equipment equivalent of Bestow. A card with Reconfigure enters the battlefield unattached as a creature, after which its controller may pay the cost to attach or unattach it from a creature at sorcery speed. It is not a creature for as long as it is attached. Umbra Armor, or Totem Armor, as introduced in Rise of the Eldrazi, is an ability of auras that means if the enchanted permanent would be destroyed, instead all damage is removed from it, and the aura is destroyed instead. Crossing my fingers that this is not going to create the same attention in my comments section that using the terminology title did. Please and thank you. Now we've just got to go over the rest of the mechanics in this tier. When you cast a spell with Cypher, you may exile it encoded on a creature you control. Then, whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player, you may cast a copy of the exiled card without paying its mana cost. If a permanent is detained, it can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. All Azorius are bastards. You may return a card with Dredge to your hand by milling the specified number of cards where you would otherwise draw a card. Dredge rates pretty highly on the Storm scale given the balance issues around it. While under normal logic, stronger cards having higher Dredge values and requiring you to sacrifice more resources to recur them would make sense, their ability to fuel graveyard strategies purely through dredging rather than ever actually being cast makes balancing around the mechanic difficult and counterintuitive. Forecast allows you to pay a cost to reveal the card from your hand for an effect only during your upkeep and only once each turn. Forecast abilities were usually in the vein of weaker versions of the card's core effect, or support for casting it later that turn. But this mechanic proved to be hard to interact with as well as repetitive. I, for one, find the concept of upkeep peekaboo hilarious, but Understandably, this reduced its odds to return. Right. I realized when writing this script that I missed venture into the dungeon or venture into specify dungeon here, but we've arrived at the initiative, so I'm going to cover them both here. Sorry. Originating from the Dungeons & Dragons themed set Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, an ability that has you venture puts a dungeon of your choice into the command zone if you don't have one already. Then you put a venture marker on the first room. After that, if you venture, you move the marker to the next room, triggering the ability of that room. After the last ability resolves or leaves the stack, the dungeon is removed from the game, and you have completed the dungeon, which grants certain cards bonuses. The next time you venture, you may choose a different dungeon or the same one. You're judging me right now. I can feel you're judging me. You know what? All right. I prepare for this scenario. See, it's fixed. Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate then introduced the initiative, a player designation similar to Monarch, which you lose if a player deals combat damage to you. It has you specifically enter the Undercity, a new dungeon created for the set. Having the initiative also triggers bonuses on specific cards, but additionally has you venture on your upkeep for as long as you have it. Importantly, you cannot enter any of the Forgotten Realms dungeons by taking the initiative, and you cannot enter the Undercity by venturing into the dungeon. However, both let you progress in whichever dungeon you are already in. I feel like both of these could definitely go lower down given the requirement for supplemental materials in reminder card form, but I like them, so you can fight me. Huh? Rise of the Eldrazi's level up gave us these weirdos, and is an activated ability that lets you pay a cost to put a level counter on the permanent at sorcery speed. At higher levels, the permanent receives benefits like additional abilities or stronger stat blocks. The mechanic was based around the design for Figure of Destiny, and notably the format of that card has been returned to for cards like Frodo Sauron's Bane, where level up was discontinued. Both Collect Evidence and Suspect were introduced in Murders at Karlov Manor, a set we all love very much. Collect Evidence is a keyword action where you exile cards from your graveyard with the combined specified mana value or greater, usually as part of an additional cost to cast a spell, while Suspect is a creature designation that means it has menace and can't block and incentivizes attacking. And finally, a card with Transmute allows you to pay the transmute cost and discard it to search your library for a card with the same mana value as it. Reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle at sorcery speed. We've finished Rare. Welcome to the niche tier. It's like Rare, but with a little more panache. Here we are going to find even more narrow, set-specific mechanics, a couple weirdos, and generally speaking, 10 or less cards of their kind. Let's dig in. Confined to Legions, Amplify allows you to reveal any number of creature cards that share a creature type with the creature as it enters, then put the specified number of +1/+1 counters on it for each card revealed this way. Legions also gave us Provoke. Whenever a creature with this ability attacks, its controller may have a target creature the defending player controls untap and block it if otherwise able. It appears on 9 cards and 1 sticker from Unfinity. However, it is otherwise unlikely to return given the existence of fight mechanics. Kaldheim's Boast abilities are activated abilities that can only be activated after the creature with the ability attacks, and only once each turn, in order to give them a drawback. A spell with Cleave can be cast for an alternate cost to remove the words in square brackets from its effect. In this way it functions similarly to Overload, but appears only on cards from Innistrad Crimson Vow. I personally can never decide whether it's an elegant design or visually a bit clunky. Completed is a replacement effect exclusive to Planeswalkers that takes into account how Phyrexian mana pips in their cost are paid for. For each Phyrexian mana paid with life, the Planeswalker enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters on it. A spell with Demonstrate allows you to copy it when you cast it. If you do, you choose an opponent to also copy it. It made its debut in Commander 2021 and is themed to match the Strixhaven setting of the release. Doctor Who gave us 2 new keywords. Face a Villainous Choice offers a player's opponent a choice of 2 negative effects, and when you time travel, you may add or remove a time counter from each suspended card you own and each permanent you control with a time counter on it. Introduced in Bloomburrow and mechanically tied to the squirrels of the set, to forage is to exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food. It's worth noting that foraging is a specific action, and you are not considered to have foraged by doing either of these actions otherwise. I said we'd get to it. With only 2 appearances, Future Sight and Fallout, Fortify is just a quip, but for lands. Anticlimactic. The incredibly Assassin's Creed free-running is an alternate cost that you may pay to cast a spell if you have dealt combat damage to a player that turn with an assassin or your commander. It is essentially a variation on Morningtide's Prowl, which allows you to cast the spell for its Prowl cost if you have dealt combat damage to a player that turn with a creature of the specified type. Appearing only on cards originally from Guild Pact, a creature with Haunt is exiled when it dies, haunting a target creature. These creatures then have additional abilities that trigger when the creature they are haunting dies. It is considered a mistake, with Duskmorn Came Impending, which appears on the 5 Overlord enchantment creatures in the set. If a spell is cast for its impending cost, it enters with the specified number of time counters on it, and is not a creature until the last is removed. It functions similarly to Suspend, however time counters are removed on your end step instead of your upkeep, and it allows ETB triggers to go off right away because you are still casting the spell. It ends up on the battlefield after this resolves. Whenever a creature with Ingest deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top card of their library. It was only used on 9 cards in Dual Deck Zendikar vs Eldrazi and Battle for Zendikar. Ingest. I only said it ingest. The Transformers cards that rolled out with Brothers War came with a trio of specific keywords. Living Metal appears on their vehicle faces, and is an ability that means they are also creatures on your turn. This is notably their only means of becoming creatures on this side, as they lack crew costs. More Than Meets the Eye is an alternate casting cost which allows you to cast them converted, and Convert is a transform keyword specific to these cards. Yes, I appreciate the irony that Transformers don't transform, but this is the term Hasbro uses on its products so as not to weaken the trademark. Yes, really. Continuing the theme of double-faced cards, Meld is the keyword action that means to turn 2 Meld cards over onto their back faces into 1 big card. The melded card is a single permanent and behaves like any other lame, regular-sized card of its type. If the melded card leaves the battlefield, both cards go to the same zone and revert to their front faces. There were 6 pairs of meld cards, 3 of which are from Eldritch Moon, with the other 3 being from Brothers War. Escalate is another Eldritch Moon mechanic and appears on modal spells with the clause choose 1 or more. For each time you pay a spell's escalate cost, you may choose another one of its modes. It's finally time to talk about the discontinued kind of phasing. A keyword that causes a permanent to phase out on its controller's untap step if it isn't already, and phase in on the untap step if it's phased out. It appears on or is granted by a total of 16 cards, and is a nightmare that leads to rules text like that on Time and Tide. Hideous. We've already covered creatures that give poison counters with Infect and Toxic, but let's not forget that Poisonous is its own keyword, appearing on just Snake Cult Initiation and Virulent Sliver from Future Sight. It is mechanically similar to Toxic, specifying a value for how many poison counters the player receives. However, Poisonous is a triggered ability tied to whenever the creature deals combat damage, whereas Toxic is instantaneous, with counters being added with combat damage. Appearing on only 6 cards from Cold Snap, a spell with Ripple allows you to reveal the specified number of cards from the top of your library, then cast any number of spells with the same name as the spell with Ripple, revealed this way without paying their mana costs. Outside of cards like Slime Against Humanity that allow you to include any number of copies in your deck, it's not particularly useful in Commander, and the popularity of the format makes it unlikely to return. Solved is a triggered ability tied to the case subtype of enchantments from Murder's a Color of Mana. Cases check at the beginning of your end step whether their conditions are met, and become solved if they are. The meaning of solved is different depending on the type of ability the case has. In the case of an activated ability, it means it can only be activated if the case is solved. In the case of a triggered ability, it only triggers if the case is solved, and if it's a static ability, once the case is solved, it applies. Soul Shift. Soul Shift is a triggered ability of creatures exclusively from the original Kamigawa block. When a creature with Soul Shift dies, you may return a target spirit card with a mana value less than or equal to the specified value from your graveyard to your hand. It's a pretty narrow design space, which is probably why we haven't seen it pop up again since. Another Commander mechanic, and the last one in our niche tier, a spell with Undaunted costs 1 generic less to cast for each opponent you have. It was last used in Battle for Baldur's Gate, and appears on a whopping 6 cards. We're in our penultimate tier, which I have affectionately termed It Has What? I hope you're ready to meet, or get reacquainted with, some real weirdos. You've got the pinnacle of set specificity, the most necessary of reminder text, and really just some brain breakers. In this tier comes the moment you've no doubt all been waiting for. It's finally time for Angry Green Jellybean explains banding. There. So without further ado, the true runt of the litter when it comes to alpha babies, banding is a creature-specific keyword that allows creatures to attack in groups or bands. Any number of creatures with banding, and up to 1 creature without, may attack or block in a band, which are blocked or block as a group. If a creature with banding blocks or is blocked, its controller decides how damage is divided between the banded creatures. This flips the rules for assigning multiple blockers. We also have the variant bands with other thing, which allows any number of creatures with the specified characteristics to band as long as one has the ability. The same rules apply as above. Let's have an example, shall we? Let's say I control a Banalish hero, Banalish infantry, and a 1/1 soldier token. I choose to band these together to attack. You control a 2/2 wolf token. If you were to block, I can choose to assign all of the wolf's combat damage to Banalish infantry, so none of my creatures die, and your wolf will take a total of 3 damage. This works the same with blocking, however, instead of the normal scenario where you, the attacker, decide how combat damage is assigned, I decide how the damage is distributed between my banded creatures. If that all made sense, congratulations to you for understanding, and congratulations to me for being such a great teacher. This mechanic is the go-to when it comes to Magic being confusing, and at least in standard legal sets, it is incredibly unlikely to return, given Maro rating banding a 10 on the Storm scale, and banding with being the sole 11 out of 10 to exist. Worse even than Storm itself. While Mutate originally appeared as a keyword on Unsanctioned's Surgeon General Commander, no spells actually had the ability until it somehow broke containment in Ikoria Lair of Behemoths. If a spell is cast for its Mutate cost, It is put either over or under a target non-human creature you specifically own and control, with the resulting mutant having the characteristics of the top card, in addition to all the abilities of the bottom card. Despite this, if you are a sick freak who wants to mutate your commander, given that the mutated creature is considered a single object, it will still deal commander damage, regardless of where your commander actually is in the pile. Mutate is not definitely dead, rating a 7 on the Storm scale, but Maro has acknowledged that while beloved by a small minority, it is confusing to the majority of players. We are going to see a lot of Future Sight in these last two tiers, though Fate Seal, or Evil Scry, as it's affectionately known, goes all the way back mechanically to Mirage. To Fate Seal, you look at the specified number of cards from the top of an opponent's library, then put any number of them on the bottom or top in any order. It has only been printed on 2 cards, Mesmeric Sliver, weird mechanic, there's a sliver for that, and spin into Myth. Unfortunately, despite some potentially fun applications, we're unlikely to see this return in the future, with Maro terming it kind of mean in his Future Sight design handoff document. Gravestorm, or Green Needle to some people, appears on only 2 cards. The first was Bitter Ordeal, but the keyword made a surprise return in Murders at Call of Mana Commander on Follow the Bodies. It is essentially Storm, however, the spell is copied for each permanent put into a graveyard that turn, rather than spells cast before it. It's unlikely to be in any standard legal sets in the future, however, as it's internally considered to have a lot of the same problems as Storm. If Future Sight is king of the weirdos, a original Kamigawa block is a close second. A jester or a trickster or a little menace guy, you know? Yes, we're talking about flip cards. These are cast with the mana cost and corresponding name and rules text the right way up, then have conditions that must be met for them to flip. Flip itself is simply a keyword action meaning to rotate the card 180 degrees on its front face, after which the correct way up rules text applies. These visual nightmares are not coming back now that we have double face cards, thank God for sleeves, and were termed a failure by Maro on Blogatog. Let's move on to Epic, which appears on a cycle of 5 cards from Saviors of Kamigawa. Epic is a keyword ability that means for the rest of the game you can't cast spells, with the bonus that at the beginning of each of your upkeeps you copy that spell except for its Epic ability. Understandably, this mechanic leads to pretty narrow design space. And my god, you better hope nobody board wipes. I am, however, now considering picking up copies of each of these for my upkeep deck, because that sounds fucking hilarious. Offering is very similar to Emerge, with a couple key exceptions. The first is that it specifies a card type that must be sacrificed to pay the alternate cost, with the original patron cycle of cards each specifying a creature type. The second is that it allows you to cast a spell at instant speed. Otherwise, similarly, the mana cost of the spell is reduced by the mana cost of the sacrifice permanent. This is another example of an originally very narrow mechanic with a solid fundamental premise, given that we later got Emerge and that a new type of offering, Artifact Offering, appeared as a one-off on Blast Furnace Hellkite in Brothers War Commander. Rampage! Rampage is a triggered ability from Legends that gives a stat bonus of the specified value for each creature that blocks it beyond the first. Rampage as a keyword had 2 main problems, in that cards with the ability were costed as though they already had the bonus, and that it never actually applied because it inherently disincentivizes the action that triggers it. You could block my creature with 2 creatures, but then my creature deals more damage, is not a great sales pitch. This realization led to the development of cards like Gang of Elk, which receive a stat bonus for each creature blocking them. But this was never keyworded despite being referred to colloquially as New Rampage. Recover is a keyword exclusive to Cold Snap that is triggered when a creature is put into your graveyard. If the card with recover is in your graveyard when this happens, you may pay its recover cost to return it to your hand. Otherwise, it's exiled. As a result, you only get one opportunity to pay the recover cost. It only features on 7 cards, all of which are instants and sorceries, apart from Garza's Assassin, a creature which also has the ability to destroy a non-black creature by sacrificing it. It was described as clunky by Maro, which I don't disagree with. Unsets. They've given us some great mechanics over the years, but the last Unfinity attempted to straddle the line of legality by featuring black-bordered cards, opting instead for an acorn sigil to denote whether they are playable in constructed formats. Attractions live in that in-between space, with a number being legal and a number not. But any mechanic that requires an entire secondary deck is pretty wild. To open an attraction, you put the top card of your attractions deck onto the battlefield. And then at the beginning of your first main phase, if you have an attraction on the battlefield, you roll a d6, and if the result matches any of the lit numbers on attractions you control, you visit it, which triggers its ability. It's an interesting concept, and I'm well up for seeing attraction decks when playing Commander, but most people I speak to profess not to know what they actually do, which often leads to them not being interacted with and the attractions player running away with the game given enough time. And boy, do those decks take some time. We've reached the aforementioned height of set specificity. Universes beyond set specificity. Hiya, future Ian here. I figured out at this point that I had fucked up. My graphic didn't have the ring temps U, and my script didn't have daybound/nightbound due to a clerical error. So, daybound and nightbound, right? When a game starts, it is neither day or night, with this being introduced when a permanent with daybound or an ability that specifies it becomes day enters. This notably doesn't use the stack. Once it is day, it becomes night on the following turn if a player casts no spells during their turn. It becomes day again the turn after a player casts at least 2 spells during their own turn. A creature with these abilities has its daybound face up during day, then changes to its nightbound face if it becomes night, and back to daybound if it becomes day. Most players, myself included, are not fans of this mechanic as it's a ball ache to track and actively disincentivizes you playing spells, as the nightbound sides are often stronger. Anyway, back to it. We've reached the aforementioned height of set specificity. Universes beyond set specificity. The ring tempts you is similar to Venture in that it activates a command zone effect. When it happens, you gain an emblem named the Ring if you do not already have one. You choose a creature you control to become your ring bearer, which if you already have one, you may choose the same or another creature, and then the ring gains its next ability on the track of 4. These being 1. Your ring bearer is legendary and can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. 2. Whenever your ring bearer attacks, draw a card, then discard a card. 3. Whenever your ring bearer becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller sacrifices it at the end of combat. And 4. Whenever your ring bearer deals combat damage to a player, each opponent loses 3 life. The ring tempts you shares the issue with Venture of often requiring a full reminder card for players to know exactly what it does, which can make it feel a bit bloated. It's also unlikely to return due to being thematically tied to the Lord of the Rings universe, and despite mechanically representing the corrupting influence of the ring, it misses flavorfully a bit by only providing upside. Unlike the One Ring itself, which offers a massively powerful effect with a tangible drawback. We have arrived. The true pits of keywords, the absolute freaks of the deep. So, why are they here? What separates them from all those we've covered already? Well, each of the following keywords appear only on a single card. One doesn't even appear on a card at all. Also, a couple are illegal, but I really wanted to talk about them, so... Yes, while all of the other keywords we've covered so far are Commander legal, Anti has snuck onto this list. Because, well, it wouldn't be a video about weird keywords without it, right? Banding was the runt of the alpha litter. This is the Antichrist. If players agree to play for Anti, they each put a random card from their library into the Anti-zone, with the winner taking permanent ownership of cards in the zone. There are a total of 9 cards which refer to playing for Anti, with all of them requiring that they be removed from your library before the game if you are not playing for Anti. If straight up gambling wasn't bad enough already, cards like Rebirth let you gamble more for the benefit of healing your life total, and Dark Pact even lets you just straight up take your opponent's Anti by swapping it with the top card of your library. Understandably, WotC was concerned about the anti-mechanic causing official tournaments to be legally recognized as gambling, particularly leading to venues requiring licenses as well as other restrictions being put in place, and they banned the mechanics from all sanctioned events. The last card to bear Anti was Homeland's Temerian Fiends, which has the ability to pay 3 black and sacrifice it to destroy an artifact an opponent controls, and put that artifact into your graveyard and put Fiends into theirs, resulting in a permanent change in ownership. The 90s was wild. Let's cover our last batch of future sighters, shall we? Lymph Sliver gives all slivers absorb 1, which means if a source would deal damage to that creature, 1 of that damage is prevented. While Frenzy Sliver gives all slivers Frenzy 1, which gives a creature +1/+0 whenever it attacks and isn't blocked. Arcanum Wings has Aura Swap, which allows you to pay 2 generic and a blue mana to exchange it from the battlefield with an Aura card in your hand. And finally, Flesh Writher has Transfigure, which lets you pay black, black, and 1 generic to sacrifice it, search your library for a creature card with the same converted mana value, and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle at sorcery speed. We've got one last Unfinity keyword here. Space Balerin has Space Sculptor, which divides the battlefield into alpha, beta, and gamma sectors. If a creature is not assigned to a sector, its controller assigns it to one, with opponents of Space Balerin's controller choosing first. The sectors do not change anything inherently, rather they correspond to Space's activated abilities. While we've covered plenty of keywords that have been put to rest, Landhome is unique in that after being made obsolete, it was actually errated off of all of the cards it previously appeared on, instead being written out in full as, if defending player controls no land type, this creature cannot attack. If you control no land type, sacrifice this creature. You might recognize it from everyone's favorite forgetful fish, Dandan. We covered Destroy all the way back at the beginning of this video, and you might well know that the terminology used to be Bury. When this change was made, all cards were errated to use Destroy, with the exception of 1. Aswan Jaguar is one of 12 Astral cards, created exclusively for the 1997 Microprose game Chandalar. Why it sneaks onto this list, however, is because Aswan Jaguar has 1 physical printing, a 6-inch by 9-inch physical printing in fact, which never had its Oracle text updated. Due to its size, it's technically not legal in any format, but it is legal in my heart. Deep down at the bottom of the ocean floor, the treasure for which we have dove through the seemingly endless waters of keywords, lies substance. Never printed on a magic card. No inherent effect. Confined to Oracle text. Substance was introduced with the 2005 rules update for Ravnica City of Guilds in order to restore the functionality of a number of cards that were affected by timing changes in 6th edition. The bulk of cards affected that received this keyword were originally printed in Mirage, a time when the main phase was followed by a discard phase, then a cleanup phase. With the 6th edition rules update came the modern turn structure. The cleanup phase was renamed the end phase and divided into the end step and cleanup step. With this rules change, effects that occur at end of turn were moved to the beginning of the end step, while until end of turn effects end at the same time that damage marked on creatures is removed. In the majority of cases, this didn't make a difference, with the exception of 12 cards. An example of this is Soar, an aura that grants a creature +0/+1 and flying, and that can be cast as though it had flash, with the condition it is then sacrificed at end of turn. Without the addition of substance, this created a situation where the enchantment was sacrificed before damage was removed from creatures, which could create a scenario where damage already marked on the creature could become lethal when the enchantment was removed. What's the rules text for Substance, you ask? Substance is a static ability with no effect. It purely existed as something for the rules to check for to prevent this early sacrifice effect due to the changes, and was ultimately removed in the Magic 2010 rules update, leading to the slightly verbose rules text that you might have seen on the most recent printing of Necromancy. Magic no longer has substance, and when it did, substance was nothing in and of itself. If you've made it to this point, thank you so much for watching. As hopefully shows, I put a hell of a lot of work into bringing all of this together and scripting it to make my biggest video yet. We won't even start on... Let me know which of these keywords are your favorites or you'd like to see return. And if you would like to be the proud new owner of this monstrosity behind me, I'm going to be giving it away on my Twitter to coincide with the video's release. So if you enter, good luck! And as always, if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe,